We now come to the book of Esther. This book and the book of Ruth are the only two Old Testament books named after women. Esther, or Hadassah, meaning myrtle, explains the origin of the Feast of Purim, and it shows in graphic detail the satanically inspired sin of anti-Semitism. The story takes place in Persia, where Esther grew up with her older cousin, Mordecai. The writer of the book was no doubt a Jew who knew Persian customs and the details of the palace. It is also important to note that the events recorded took place about 55 years after Zerubbabel and the first group of exiles returned to Israel from the Babylonian captivity, but at least 20 years before Ezra and the second group of exiles made their way to Jerusalem. So the events took place between the 6th and 7th chapters of the book of Ezra. Now, like Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, the book of Esther records how Haman the Agagite tried to wipe out the Jewish race, and how God, although never mentioned, providentially protected his people from extinction. You see, almost 600 years earlier, God had ordered King Saul to wipe out the Amalekites and their king, Agag, because of what had happened during Israel's exodus from Egypt. See Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16 for more detail. However, Saul disobeyed and spared Agag's life, and God took the kingdom from him and gave it to David instead. The prophet Samuel then hacked Agag in pieces. All of this history matters because when we come here to the book of Esther, we see that Haman, a descendant of Agag, still had a deep hostility, resentment, and hatred for the Jews, and his hatred for God's chosen people bubbled to the surface because Mordecai, a descendant of King Saul, would not bow before him, as we shall see. As I stated earlier, God's name is never mentioned in the 167 verses of Esther, though fasting is mentioned, but his presence and power are clearly manifested throughout, as he provides deliverance for his people through a series of events and actions that were providentially put in place. Psalm 121 verse 4 says, "Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." And that promise by God is kept throughout the pages of this book. So, let us take a close look at the book and see how God providentially exalted a young Jewish girl to the position of Queen of Persia, so that she would be in a place of prominence and power to save the Jewish people from annihilation and extinction. Here's the outline. Chapter 1, the expulsion of Vashti decreed. Chapter 2, the elevation of Esther accomplished. Chapters 3 and 4, the extermination of the Jews planned. Chapters 5 through 9, the extermination of the Jews thwarted. And chapter 10, the exaltation of Mordecai. So with that, let us begin. In chapter 1, the story begins with King Ahasuerus, the leader of Medo-Persia, throwing a feast for all his officials and servants, and he displayed the riches and glory of his kingdom for 180 days. At the end of the first feast, he threw a second feast lasting 7 days, but this time it was open to all the people of Shushan, one of 4 capital cities. The wine flowed freely, and guests were permitted to drink as much or as little as they chose. Now, during the second feast, Queen Vashti also held her own feast for the women in the royal palace. During this time, King Ahasuerus, drunk with wine, ordered the eunuchs to bring Vashti to his feast, so that he could show her beauty to the people. It appears that the king was asking her to degrade herself to satisfy his drunken whim. Vashti refused, and the king was furious. After consulting his wise men, they told him that the queen's behavior would prove a bad example to the women throughout the kingdom. So they advised that a decree be made, banishing her from the face of the king forever and giving her position to someone else. Their reasoning was, when this was circulated throughout the king's vast kingdom, all wives, great and small, would honor their husbands. By the way, the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be altered, not even by the king. The king was pleased with their advice, and the decree was circulated throughout each of the provinces of his kingdom. In chapter 2, after the feasts, the king seemed somewhat remorseful concerning the decree against Vashti. So his counselors proposed that a search be made among all the beautiful young virgins for a young woman to become queen in her place. The decree was circulated, and Esther, a beautiful young Jewish woman who had been adopted by her cousin Mordecai after the death of her parents, was taken to the king's palace. Immediately, Esther obtained favor in the eyes of Haggai, the keeper of the harem. He gave her beauty preparations beside her allowance, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Again, though God's name is not mentioned, we begin to see his hands working in all these events. Now, in obedience to Mordecai, she had not revealed her ethnic origin to anyone. We're also told that it took 12 months of preparation before the women were brought into the king's bedchamber. And after that night, they would never be with him again, unless she so pleased him that he asked for her by name. When it was time for Esther to be seen by the king, we are told that she obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. And when she was finally in the king's presence, again we are told that she obtained grace and favor in his sight, more than all the virgins. Esther was made queen, and a great feast was held in her honor. Again we are told that Esther had not yet revealed her ethnic origin to anyone, on the counsel of her cousin Mordecai. Now, one day while Mordecai was at the king's gate, he overheard a plot to assassinate the king. So he reported it to Esther, who in turn notified the king. The assassins were investigated, tried, and hanged, and the incident was recorded in the official chronicles of the kingdom. Mordecai was not rewarded immediately, but he would be at the most crucial time. Again, God's unseen hand was slowly moving things into place. In chapter 3, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite above all the princes in his kingdom, and he ordered that homage was to be paid to Haman. But unlike the other servants, Mordecai, a Jew and a descendant of King Saul, would not bow before Haman, and he was filled with wrath because of it. Haman was an extremely prideful and vindictive anti-Semite, and instead of dealing with Mordecai alone, he purposed in his heart to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. Now, lots were cast to determine when the extermination would take place, and it would not happen for an entire year. Haman then went to the king and gave him a lying report about the Jews, and he made it seem as if they were a threat to his kingdom. A decree was issued by the king's scribes, and it was sent throughout his entire kingdom, indicating on what date the Jews were to be annihilated. Every man, woman, and child was to be killed, and their possessions were to be plundered. Afterwards, The king and Haman sat down to drink. But the people of Shushan were perplexed and in disbelief. As I stated in my introduction, 600 years earlier, King Saul was ordered by God to wipe out the Amalekites, but he disobeyed. Now, one of Agag's descendants had set the wheels in motion to wipe out the Jews. By the way, Haman cast lots to determine the date of their annihilation. But Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord." The fact that Haman's wicked plans would not be carried out for an entire year provided sufficient time for his plans to be thwarted. God was in control. In chapter 4, when Mordecai heard the news, he put on sackcloth and ashes and went throughout the whole city with a bitter cry. Also, in every province, there was great mourning among the Jews. Many fasted and lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther sent garments to Mordecai, but he would not accept them. And she sent to him to find out why he was in such great mourning. A copy of the decree was sent back to her, and Mordecai urged her to use her power to plead for the Jews. Esther sent back word to him that she had not been called in to see the king for over a month, and anyone who appeared before the king without prior invitation would be killed on the spot, unless he held out his scepter to them. Mordecai's response was blunt and to the point. She would be slain along with the rest of the Jews. And if she refused to act, help and deliverance would come from someone else, but she would perish. Then, Mordecai spoke the most well-known verse in the book. "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther then instructed the Jews to fast with her for 3 days. Then she would go before the king, even without an invitation. And with absolute resolve, she said, "If I perish, I perish." Now, chapter 5. After 3 days, Esther arrayed herself in royal apparel and stood at the inner court of the king's house, uninvited. The king held out his golden scepter and granted her safety. He then promised to grant her request, up to half his kingdom. Esther then invited the king and Haman to a banquet, and once there, the king promised again to grant her petition, up to half his kingdom, meaning he would give her whatever she desired. Esther then invited the king and Haman to a second banquet the next day, where she would make her request known. Now, filled with pride and self-indulgence, Haman left the banquet joyful and with a glad heart. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, he was filled with indignation, because Mordecai did not honor him. Haman went home and called his friends and his wife, and recounted the incredible events of the day. He then bragged about his riches, the multitude of his children, and his exalted position in the king's palace. He then brought up Mordecai, and his wife and his friends advised him to make gallows 50 cubits high, about 75 feet, and request that the king hang Mordecai on it. The advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. In chapter 6, later on that night, the king could not sleep, so he commanded that the book of the records of the Chronicles be read to him. By divine providence, the record of Mordecai thwarting the assassination plot against him was read, and the king wanted to know what honor was given to him. The answer was nothing. At the same time, Haman had arrived at the palace to request the hanging of Mordecai. Immediately, Ahasuerus asked Haman, "What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor?" Filled with pride again, Haman thought within himself that surely the king had him in mind. Haman answered that the man should be clothed in one of the king's royal apparel. A royal crown was to be put on his head. He was to be set on one of the king's horses, and as he rode throughout the city, one of the noble princes was to proclaim to all that thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. The king ordered Haman to make haste and do to Mordecai all that he had spoken. Haman carried out the king's orders, and after that, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, and Haman hurried home mourning and in total despair. Haman reported the day's strange events to his wife and friends, and they told him that he would fall before Mordecai. Proverbs 16:18 was coming to pass. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Finally, in this chapter, while they were still speaking, the king's officials arrived at his house to escort him to the banquet that Esther had prepared. The stage was now set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in all of Scripture. Now, chapter 7. The time of reckoning had arrived. King Ahasuerus and Haman arrived at the banquet, and once again the king asked Esther to make her petition known, and he would give her up to half his kingdom. Finally, Esther answered that if she had found favor in his sight, then he should spare his queen and her people from annihilation, and if they had only been sold as slaves, then she would have held her peace. The king indignantly asked who had plotted such a thing and presumed in his heart to do so. Esther then answered that the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Haman was scared stiff. King Ahasuerus, angry as a lion, got up and stormed into the palace garden. Haman, begging and pleading for his life, then threw himself down on the couch where Esther was. The king then walked back inside and interpreted Haman's behavior as trying to assault his queen sexually. The die had been cast, and Haman's fate was now sealed. The king's servants then covered Haman's face, a sign that he was going to be killed, and one of them told the king about the gallows that Haman had made to hang Mordecai on. The king ordered that Haman be hanged on it instead. Haman was hanged on the gallows, and the king's wrath was then pacified. What Haman had planned for Mordecai came back on his own head, and he had finally reaped what he had sown. Now, I will quickly summarize the events of chapters 8 through 10. Haman's house was given to Esther, and his position was given to Mordecai. Esther once again pleaded for the life of her people, because the first decree was still in effect and could not be revoked, even by the king. So he permitted the queen and Mordecai to write another decree, counteracting the first one. Mordecai dictated an edict to the king's scribes, giving the Jews the right to protect their lives and their property. The edict was then sent throughout the king's entire kingdom, from India to Ethiopia. The Jews were overjoyed, and many people became proselytes to the Jewish faith. When the day came for the Jews to be destroyed, they gathered together in their respective cities and destroyed their enemies instead. Even the rulers, lieutenants, deputies, and officers helped the Jews because they feared Mordecai, who is now the second most powerful person in the kingdom. 800 men were killed in Shushan, and 75,000 throughout the rest of the provinces. Even the 10 sons of Haman were killed and hanged on gallows. A great feast was held on the 14th and 15th days of the month, and this was the beginning of Purim. The name Purim comes from Pur, the lot which Haman had cast. Mordecai decreed that both days should be observed by all Jewish people annually, as a reminder to succeeding generations of this marvelous deliverance. Finally, the book closes with the exaltation of Mordecai, and it was all recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. He was second only to the king, and he sought the good of his people. So, the book of Esther, a fascinating book showing the providence of God in arranging circumstances in such a way that his people, the Jews, would have an advocate in the court of the most powerful man on the planet, who would be able to save them from one of the most anti-Semitic men who has ever walked the face of the earth. He that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. Now, in our next study, we will take a look at the oldest and one of the most well-known books in the Bible, and we will read about the suffering and the life of one of the most God-fearing men in all of history. So, our next stop, the book of Job.